Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third part of our series about the study permit extension. And today I have with me the amazing experts in the field, which is Aska Nakamura and Roman Kohut. Hello, Aska and Roman, and welcome. Roman will read now the land acknowledgement, and then we will shortly speak about the topic that we are going to discuss. And basically, it will be the five mistakes that students usually make when they're applying for the study permit extension. And then we will move actually to our presentation, followed by some Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It's such a pleasure to be hosting with you as well, our wonderful expert in the field, Aska. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and today is Friday, July the 31st, 2026. You'll see that in addition to Natalie and my logo, we also have Immigracia Visa Consulting, which is Ankita Goyal's from last session. So feel free to connect with Ankita as well. However, Ankita is not going to be joining us for this session. This information that's provided during this webinar is for general educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute personalized immigration advice. Immigration laws, policies, and procedures are subject to change, and requirements may vary depending on individual circumstances. All the participants and viewers are encouraged to seek professional advice for guidance specific to their situation. Natalie and I will have our QR codes and information that you could use to reach out to us if you choose to get a personalized consultation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roman, for this. And I would like to start with a short introduction of my colleague and my very good friend, Roman Kohut, who is a founder and principal consultant at Safe Harbor Immigration Services. He is a regulated Canadian immigration consultant with over 10 years of experience in international education and student services across different institutions such as University of British Columbia, which is situated in Vancouver. This is where he is currently working. As well, he previously worked at New York University in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, and the American Councils for International Education. Roman holds graduate diploma in immigration and citizenship law from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, as well as the master degree in education from UBC. Through his work, Roman helps individuals and families navigate their Canadian immigration journey with clarity, compassion, and confidence. Roman, to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this kind and warm introduction, Natalie. And it's my pleasure to introduce my wonderful co-host, Natali Saad. She's the founder and CEO of Natali Saad Immigration Consulting Incorporated. Natalie is also a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. She's an entrepreneur. She's a graduate of Queen's University Faculty of Law. She also holds a master's degree in international relations and political sciences. She has over 6 years of experience working in the field of immigration. And drawing on her professional experience in immigration consulting and her own journey as an immigrant to Canada, she helps clients navigate complex immigration pathways with integrity, empathy, and practical guidance. Natalie's company is based in Ontario, in Toronto. However, she also works very closely with a lot of students and other clients in the Middle East, specifically in Saudi Arabia. Natalie is very passionate about empowering newcomers to achieve their educational, professional, and personal goals in Canada. And it is also my absolute pleasure to welcome our subject matter expert on study permit extensions, Aska Nakamura, who is an international student advisor at the University of British Columbia. Aska is an international student advisor. She is also regulated international student immigration advisor, RISIA. She's originally from Japan. However, she moved to Canada when she was 18. She has over 16 years of experience in international education across K-12 and post-secondary institutions in British Columbia. She brings her expertise in immigration advising, holistic student support, and strategic program planning to enhance service quality and promote international student success. With a student-centered approach grounded in empathy, cultural sensitivity, and practical guidance, Aska is dedicated to empowering international students and their families through their transitions to life in Canada. Thank you so much for joining us today, Aska.
Thank you, Roma.
Yeah, thank you, Aska. Yeah, we're so excited to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, so let's start with our webinar. So we're just going to briefly speak about what is actually the study permit extension and who can apply for it, and then Aska will go to the to the meat of it and talk about all the five most common mistakes. And as I already mentioned, we will conclude our session with some questions and answers. So basically, when a student holds a study permit in Canada, the validity or the expiry date on the study permit is when they are supposed to stop their studies and leave Canada. However, in case you haven't finished your studies but by that time, because sometimes study permit can only be issued until the validity or the expiry date of your passport, or for whatever other reasons, then you can apply for or for example, if you took a leave, right? So in this case, you are eligible to apply for the study permit extension. And it's always important to watch out for this date, to keep it in mind. And because in case or if you fall out of status, or if you stay in Canada beyond the validity of your study permit, then you'll be out of status and you will need to apply for something called restoration. And during that period of time, so you will be applying for a new, study permit and restoration of your status, your temporary status. And during this time, you cannot study. So that's why it's very important to keep in mind that extension of your study permit and the validity of it is very important. Roman, to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's a really important topic for students to remember because actually July 31st, funny enough, is a very common date for many students when it's the last day of their study permit validity. And I think for the most part, it's because there are specific tutorials on different DLI, designated learning institutions websites, that suggest that students add a couple of extra months to their study permit, right? So that they're able to most likely just apply for post-graduation work permit. Since a lot of students are really, as they study in Canada, they may decide that they want to start working here and pursue their career here and potentially at some point become a permanent resident and maybe even a citizen. If they like the country, if they like the city, they want to stay, they have job opportunities, why not? So in order, as we've discussed in post-graduation work permit session webinar, in order for students to be able to apply for post-graduation work permit from inside Canada, their study permit still has to be valid. And study permit remains valid up until the letter of completion is issued or the final grades are posted, or 90 days post that, right? Or when the study permit actually expires. Because for some students, they may have actually a couple more years left on their study permit, but they could be done with their program. So in that case, their study permit will be valid for 90 days post program completion. But without any further clarifications, I just want to pass it on to our subject matter expert, Aska. Thank you so much again for joining us on your day off. We really, truly appreciate your presence here, and it's invaluable that you can provide this advice to students. You've seen hundreds and hundreds of applications and you've seen thousands of students over your years of work, and you're probably the best person to ask about what are some of the five most common mistakes that students make when they apply for their study permit extensions.
Yes, thank you, Roman. Hi, everyone. My name is Aska Nakamura, and it's my pleasure to be joining you two today. And yes, I would be talking about the five common mistakes that students often make when they're applying for a study permit extension. And before I jump into the common mistake, I also wanted to mention quickly about the study permit extension and how that's different from the initial study permit application or the study permit application from outside Canada. So when you extend your study permit, you will have to do so before the expiry date of your current study permit. And you can also do that only from inside Canada. So you have to be physically located in Canada in order to extend your current study permit. And if you're outside Canada, even if your study permit is still valid, you're not able to submit the study permit extension. Another thing is that the study permit does not go beyond the expiry date of your passport. So if you have a passport expiring, you might have to extend your passport before you can extend your study permit. And with that, I will talk about the 5 common mistakes, and I'll start with the mistake 1, waiting too long to apply. And I would say this is probably the most common mistake that I see among international students. And a lot of students think that they're fine as long as they apply 30 days before their study permit expires. And that's because IRCC's website still says it is recommended to apply at least 30 days before the expiry. But my advice is not to rely on that recommendation because it's quite outdated. The actual processing time for a study permit extension is usually much longer than 30 days. And as of today, July 31st, 2026, it's showing 71 days for the study permit extension processing time, which is fairly short compared to the average in the last year or so. For the current processing time, I typically recommend applying about 3 to 4 months before your current study permit expires. And one thing to keep in mind is that processing times are updated weekly and can change quite a bit throughout the year. And they're only estimates based on the 80% of previous applications. So they don't really tell you exactly how long your application will take. And they don't also include the extra time that may take to submit your passport for visa stamping if you need to apply for a visa as well. And the main issue with leaving it until the last minute is that things might not always go as planned. You might run into technical issues, payment problems, or you realize that you're missing an important document. And if that happens close to your expiry date, it can be very stressful to collect all of your documents last minute. And when I say apply in advance, some students ask, how early can I apply then? Sometimes students want to submit their application right away because they're worried that they'll forget later. And although I love it when students are on top of their applications, unfortunately, applying too early isn't always a good idea either. The problem is that supporting documents like your bank statements can become outdated by the time an officer reviews your application. And there's also a chance that an officer might think that your application was submitted too far in advance, so they might set it aside and process more urgent applications instead. So if you need to apply more than 6 months in advance because of your upcoming travel plans or another reason, I would suggest including a letter of explanation to explain why you're applying so far in advance. Yeah. And the second mistake that I would talk about is confusing maintained status with guaranteed reentry. And many of you have probably heard of maintained status, but for those who haven't, I'll give a quick overview. If you submit your study permit extension application before your current study permit expires, and if you remain in Canada, you will benefit from what's called maintained status after your current study permit expires. And this means you can continue studying under the same conditions while waiting for a decision. And a very common misunderstanding is that maintained status still allows you to leave, re-enter Canada, and continue studying while your application is being processed, which is not true. And the key thing here is to remember that maintained status only exists while you're physically in Canada. Once you leave Canada, you lose your status. You lose your maintained status. So for example, let's say your study permit expires on July 31st, 2026. and you realize it's about to expire and you're panicking, and you submit your extension application on July 30th, the day before. After July 31st, after your study permit expires, you will have maintained status in Canada. And you can continue studying in Canada while you're waiting for a decision. However, if you leave Canada during that period before you receive your new study permit, you will lose your maintained status. So returning to Canada can become much more complicated because you don't have a new study permit. And you might not be able to enter Canada as a student because you don't have a valid study permit. And this is why I generally don't recommend traveling outside Canada while you're on maintained status. Another thing to think about is employment. If you're working during your studies, some employers need to see a valid study permit, okay? And they might be able to extend your contract until the expiry date of your current study permit. And even though you're allowed to remain and study under maintained status, your employer may have internal policies that don't allow extensions of your contract, and that can create some complications too. So whenever possible, I encourage students to check the current processing time for the study permit extension. And based on the current processing time, which is 71 days as of today, I would recommend applying 3 to 4 months before the expiry, so you can hopefully avoid needing to rely on maintained status in the first place. Okay, so the third mistake that I have is providing incomplete or weak supporting documents. And this is another mistake that I see quite often when students don't pay close attention to their supporting documents. For example, some students upload an enrollment letter that was issued 6 months ago. And at first, it doesn't seem to be a big problem, but I always recommend requesting an updated enrollment letter from your institution, because submitting your extension means that you will have to have the updated documents so the officer can review your application. And it's important to make sure your enrollment letter or other supporting documents are recent and ideally issued within the last 30 days. You should also check whether your enrollment letter includes your expected program completion date. And this is especially important if your studies are taking longer than originally planned. So for example, if you're in a co-op program and expect to graduate maybe a term or two later than the official length of your program, you may need to update your enrollment letter that reflects your actual program completion date. Another thing is the proof of funds. And this is an area where students sometimes run into some problems. For example, if you may forget to include a letter of support from, let's say, a parent who's financially sponsoring your studies, or your bank statements might only have 3 months of banking transactions, which could also lead to a refusal in the worst case. I've also seen students upload only their passport bio data page and forget to include pages that have their visas, stamps, or other markings. That's also a common mistake that students forget. So to avoid any small mistakes, my advice is to take the time to carefully review the IRCC's documents checklist and make sure no documents are missing, and also the instructions that they have on their website before submitting your application. And even small omissions can lead to delays or, in worst case, a refusal. And you want to avoid any small mistakes. You might think that officers are not as strict when it comes to a study permit extension application because you have already been studying in Canada for a long time, but officers still need to confirm that you are meeting your study permit conditions and that you have enough financial support to continue your studies. So in my experience, it's always better to spend a little extra time reviewing your application than trying to fix a problem later when officer reaches out to you or they refuse your application. So the fourth mistake is not addressing potential concerns proactively. And this mistake is a little different because it's not necessarily about missing a document, but it's about missing an opportunity to explain or address your unique situation. A lot of students assume that if IRCC doesn't specifically ask for an explanation for your unique situation, they don't need to provide one. But if there is something unusual in your academic history or any complications that you had with your previous immigration documents, that might raise questions or concerns to a processing officer. And that's why it's usually better to explain it upfront rather than not providing any explanation and hope that the officer will understand your situation. For example, let's say you took longer than expected to complete your program. Maybe you had a gap in your studies and you took a leave during your studies. It could also be multiple terms of part-time enrollment. You might have changed your programs after a shift in your career goals. And none of these situations automatically affect your application negatively. The issue is that if you don't explain what happened, the officer only sees the information on your transcript or enrollment records, and they might not have the full picture of what has happened. So this is why where a letter of explanation becomes very helpful. And you can write a letter of explanation to explain your circumstances and include any supporting documents that help explain what happened. For example, if you have a medical condition that affected your full-time enrollment, right? You might have become part-time, you dropped some courses, or you took a time to recover. Then you might want to attach doctor's notes or any medical documents from a hospital. And a letter of authorized leave from your school would also be very helpful in this case. And you can upload those documents under client information section in the optional document where you see on the online application. So yeah, remember that officers need enough information to assess whether you have been actively pursuing your studies and making reasonable progress towards completing your program, because that is a very important requirement to maintain your study permit. And my advice for you would be, if something in your application might make an officer pause and question your intention to complete your program on time, it's usually worth addressing it proactively. Okay, so we're at the last mistake here, number 5, misunderstanding the rules when changing schools. And this final mistake I want to talk about is something that a lot of students get confused. And in the past, students often thought that they could simply transfer to a new institution and update their information with IRCC. But the recent changes to the regulations have made this area much more complicated. And one situation that I see very often is when students decide to transfer to another school. and receive an admission offer from the new institution, they assume that they can immediately start studying at the new school because they already have a valid study permit from the previous school. But depending on your circumstances, that might not be the case. So you have to be very careful. And in many situations, you will need to apply for a new study permit if you transfer school. And it could be either as an extension from inside Canada, or it could be a new study permit application from outside Canada. And most of the time, you will need to wait until the new study permit is approved before you can begin studying at the new institution, like Natali said earlier. And it will depend on whether you're transferring from a high school to a post-secondary institution or transferring between post-secondary institutions. And because of these changes, it's really important to check the current requirements before making any decisions about transferring schools. And I've had students come to me after they already accepted the offer, registered for courses, or even made travel plans, and they were ready to start at the new school, only to discover that they had to defer their start day because they didn't receive their new study permit on time. And that would be very, very stressful. So my advice here is don't assume that changing schools is just an academic decision, right? It's also an immigration decision. Before you make a transition, take the time to understand how the change could affect your study permit and what steps you need to complete to remain compliant with your immigration status. So these are the 5 common mistakes that I often see. I hope that was helpful. Roman, did you have anything else to add?
This is perfect, Aska. Thank you so much for walking us through all these 5 mistakes with so much clarity and not just, describing the mistake, but also providing a very clear path forward for students, how they can plan ahead, what needs to be done in order not to experience the delays, right? Because it really, I'm sure you've seen some cases where students have had to stop studying, or, where the advice was to not study until they receive the actual study permit. So that can impact them financially, personally, psychologically, and otherwise. I will regurgitate that this is not legal advice. Neither is this personalized advice. So even though like it may seem that it is very relevant to your situation, this is not personalized advice. So please do reach out to international student advising at your school or reach out to a regulated Canadian immigration consultant or a lawyer if you have any specific questions on how this applies to your situation. And I'll pass it on to Natali.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roman, and thank you, Aska. This was super insightful, all the practical tips that you have mentioned here and what you have told us. And it's very important to to see the processing time, to do things proactively and don't assume anything, right? So that's one of the biggest tips, like that you can do things the last moment, that if you're just extending the study permit, it's something kind of guaranteed already and that's super easy. Well, it's not. So, thank you very much for this. And I think Roman will briefly cover what will be the difference between the study permit expiry versus the validity of study permit.
Thanks, Natalie. I think I briefly touched upon this earlier. However, one thing that I do want to point out before I go into the study permit expiry versus validity is that even though today is the most common date for many students' expiration of their study permit, Please remember that IRCC operates on Universal Coordinated Time Zone. And so July 31st, unless you know, it's technically UK London time. And so it may be too late for some individuals who are on the West Coast to submit the application. So it's better to always apply early. And like Aska mentioned, perhaps provide, you know, the letter of explanation if they're applying too early. If you are applying from inside Canada, it will be mailed to your Canadian address. So make sure that you can access that address or provide an address of somebody you trust where they could pass it on to you without opening that, right? Because it's your personal mail. But just to briefly discuss the study permit expiry versus validity, a lot of the times, students assume that because the study permit expires, let's say in 2029, but they completed the program in 2026 May, their study permit is still valid. Well, that is not true. There is actually only 90-day validity period post-program completion. And so it's really important to remember that. There's also other stipulations when a study permit would be considered invalid. So there's at least four. I am not going to go into these two granular things in too much detail. However, one of them I'll just mention would be maintaining full-time enrollment status, right? And you have to be considered to be actively pursuing studies. If for some reason you are not considered actively pursuing studies, then your study permit would automatically become invalid. You do need to check in with your institution's definitions for full-time purposes to understand better what is considered full-time, what is considered actively pursuing studies. However, in order to maximize our time with our wonderful guest, we also have some follow-up questions on resources, student success, etc. Aska, we apologize in advance if some of the questions are repetitive because you did cover the information in a lot of detail, so we do appreciate that. However, I think for some of our viewers, Q&A format may work better, right? And so I'll pass it on to Natali to kick us off for the Q&A section.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roman. Yeah, it's always good to reiterate things so that they stick in your mind, right? And my first question to you, Aska, would be when should international students, and you already touched upon this, but let's just repeat it again. When should international students start thinking about extending their study permit?
Mhm. Yeah, so you can start thinking about it way early. You know, you just want to make sure that you submit the application, I would say around 3 to 4 months in advance at the current processing time. But you can start preparing around 4 to 5 months just to make sure that you collect all the documents that you need for the study permit extension and you review the instructions. So yeah, you can be ready to submit.
Yeah, thank you. And just to make sure that all the documents, once you are submitting them, they're not stale. Yeah, you mentioned this is something so important. Like you'll have the current letter of enrollment, the bank statements, and everything you are submitted is very close to the date when you are actually submitting the application.
Thank you. And Aska, who needs to apply for a study permit extension and when is it required? Like, for example, is it required if you are graduating in May, your study permit expires in May, but then you are attending graduation, let's say in June or July? Do you need a study permit to attend graduation?
That's a great point, Roman. Yeah, so you only need a valid study permit until the end of your program. So you have to always have a valid study permit to be able to complete your program. So if, let's say, your program ends in April, but you have a graduation ceremony in July and you want to stay in Canada, you don't necessarily have to have a valid study permit until July. But there are other things to consider if you're, let's say, applying for a post-graduation work permit. Like Roman mentioned earlier, you have to have a valid study permit in order to apply for a post-graduation work permit from inside Canada. So if your study permit expires, let's say at the end of April, right, you might have to extend it farther. And typically, officers are able to extend your study permit for 90 days extra. after the program completion. So you might have to extend it beforehand, which is called bridging extension. It's not necessarily extending it, for a year or longer, but you can still extend it for the additional 90 days. But in general, you want to extend your study permit so that you can complete your program. And if you have another program that you're starting, again, you have to think about the timing of when to apply for another study permit extension so you can start your new program on time.
Thank you very much, Aska. So, speaking about the requirements for the eligibility, you have already mentioned that you must be physically inside Canada when applying for study permit extension, right? So, what are other requirements that you could share with us?
So in order for you to be able to submit the study permit extension, you have to be physically in Canada, and you also have to have a valid study permit, right? It's called extension because you already have a valid study permit that you want to extend. So it's very important, like we mentioned earlier, that you submit it before the expiry date, and don't wait till the last minute. Apply early, but make sure that you are physically in Canada. If you're currently outside Canada, you might have an option to apply for a new study permit from outside Canada. But if you have any travel plans to come back to Canada before the expiry date of your study permit, then that might be a good opportunity to submit the extension.
Thank you, Aska, for that comprehensive answer. What documents are typically required for a successful study permit extension?
So typically what you need is the letter of enrollment from your institution, proof of means of financial support, which is required for the new study permit as well. You need a copy of the passport pages and the digital photo. So those are very similar to other immigration applications. But depending on your specific circumstances, you might also need to include a letter of explanation that I mentioned. You might need a provincial attestation letter from your institution. And this is unique to some students who might be starting a new school. And even though you're extending your study permit, you might require to have this provincial attestation letter, or PAL, to attach to the extension. And you might also need a medical exam, family information form, or other supporting documents, depending on your situation.
Thank you very much, Aska. And another important tip that I would like you to ask you, and I would like you to share with the students, what are the important things that they should know in order to avoid the delays, or more importantly, the refusals when they're submitting their study permit extension application?
To avoid delays, you want to be prepared early, right? And that's also a common mistake when students wait until the last minute and they completely forget about it. So I think it's a good idea to make sure you know the expiry date and put it in your calendar immediately, or have it up there somewhere that you can be reminded, right, to make sure you apply on time. And I would also recommend avoiding to be on maintain status if it's possible, right? Because that could create some complications as well.
That's a
And
great.
for refusal, I think I would also recommend reviewing the instruction guides very carefully and reach out to support from RCIC or ISA, International Student Advisors at your school.
Thank you, Aska. As that leads me to my next follow-up question. What happens if a student's study permit expires before they submit an extension application?
So if your study permit expires and if you haven't submitted the extension application, and assuming that you also don't have another status like a worker, if you have a work permit, then you could still be in Canada legally as a worker. But assuming that you don't have any other status, then unfortunately you would be out of status, which means you currently don't have a legal status to stay in Canada. And depending on the situation, you might have to leave Canada immediately. That might be the best course of action. But you could also stay in Canada and restore your status, like Natali mentioned earlier. And restoring your status means you're applying for a study permit after your current study permit expired.
Thank you very much, Aska. And so my next question to you, and you have already spoken about this. However, it's always good, as I said, to reiterate this information. So can students continue studying while they're waiting for a decision on their study permit extension?
Yes, if they are on maintain status, yes, they can continue while waiting for the decision. And this could be the case if you apply in advance, but your study permit extension takes longer or there's a delay in the application. But as long as you remain in Canada, if you don't leave Canada, you can continue studying or working if you're also working at the same time under the same condition that you had before.
That's great to know, Aska. And how does a change in program, institution, or level of study affect a study permit extension?
I touched on this earlier in the fifth mistake that I see often, but if you change your institution, you will need to apply for a new study permit for that specific institution. And you will also need the provincial attestation letter as well. And you won't be able to start your new program until you receive that study permit approval. So if you're applying for the new study permit, but inside Canada, and if you have a valid study permit, it will be considered a study permit extension. So it will follow the 71-day processing time, right? So there might be a case where you apply, after you receive the letter of admission, but you still don't receive the new study permit. Unfortunately, you won't be able to start at the new school, so you might have to defer your start date. And if you're changing your levels of study, let's say from a graduate level to an undergraduate level, which is a rare case, right? But you would also need the provincial attestation letter. But if you're changing the levels from the undergraduate level to a graduate level, then you don't need the provincial attestation letter, but you still might need to extend your study permit if it expires before you can complete the next program. And if you're changing programs within the same level of study, so let's say you're just changing the program within the undergraduate program, and if it's the same institution, then you don't need to apply for the study permit extension unless you need to extend your program and need to extend your study permit again.
Thank you very much, Aska. This is super insightful. I would like to ask you also a question for those who study off the campus, sorry, for those who work off the campus. How does the study permit extension affects this kind of students who work off the campus?
So in order for students to be able to work on campus or off campus, they first have to have a study permit that allows them to do so. And typically, a study permit has conditions that say you may work in Canada on or off campus. So if that's the case, then great, you can continue working. And if you end up being on maintain status, you can still continue working on or off campus, depending on your situation. And when you extend the study permit, make sure your new study permit also contains the conditions that allow you to work. And as long as your new study permit has that conditions and you meet other requirements to be able to work on or off campus, you can continue working even while waiting for the study permit or after the new study permit is issued.
That's really good to confirm, Aska. Thank you. To check for those conditions, right? And what should students do if they're taking a leave from studies or reducing their course load before applying for an extension?
Yes, this is again an important situation that you might have to address in a study permit extension. And typically, yes, students should explain the gap in their studies if they have a leave or they're currently on the leave. And it may also need a letter from the institution approving the leave. And typically it is like a letter confirming that, yes, our institution approves your leave from studies. And I mentioned earlier that being a part-time student does not impact your study permit. You are still considered being actively pursuing studies and making a reasonable progress. And they say reasonable progress, which just means that you're currently studying, even part-time, right? So you don't have to be a full-time student, or you don't have to be enrolled in full-time in order to keep your study permit valid. And that's an important point, because a lot of students think that, oh, I have to be full-time to have a valid status in Canada. That's not true. Being a full-time student has a lot of different benefits, like being able to work while you're studying, but it's not a requirement. So you should be able to, extend your study permit as long as you are still actively pursuing studies. But if you have a gap or some multiple part-time studies, it's always a good idea to explain it in a study permit extension application.
That's great.
Right.
Just to follow up quickly, if I may,
Yeah.
I'm curious what, because I think full-time status perhaps is helpful for students who want to apply for post-graduation work permit in the future, right? Or like you mentioned, who want to be working, to be eligible to work perhaps off campus during the scheduled breaks, right? But it's really good to know, you mentioned that students could be part-time. Could you please tell us more? Could you please elaborate more on the part-time studies and maintaining, remaining actively pursuing studies?
Yeah, of course. So IRCC says students should always comply with the study permit conditions, right? And the conditions can be active in pursuing studies or making reasonable progress towards a program. And it's not very specific, right? They don't say that you have to be a full-time student. It just means that your intention in Canada is to study and complete your program. And as long as that's clear, you can be a part-time student. But like Roman mentioned, if you are interested in applying for a post-graduation work permit after you complete your program, you have to be a full-time student throughout your program. And that's because that is the main requirement for you to be eligible for a post-graduation work permit. But, if your goal here is not to apply for the post-graduation permit, and if you have some reasons that you have to be a part-time student, and it could be a medical reason, it could be a personal reason, it's okay. It shouldn't negatively impact your study permit application. But it's always a good idea to explain why you're taking only one course instead of maybe 3 courses that are usually considered full-time. Because typically international students take courses full-time, right? So this is why I mentioned that it's a good idea to explain any reason that makes you a part-time student, right? And it's also very important to know the limitations when you're a part-time student. You won't be able to work either on or off campus at all if you're a part-time student during a regular academic session. And it could also impact your eligibility for a scholarship or student housing, for example, because some institutions have specific requirements, and often cases you have to be a full-time student to benefit from those services or scholarships. So that's something that I can mention, that it's very important to check with your own institution to see if there's any requirements for you to be a full-time student, and then make a decision based on that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Aska. And so I would like to talk about more about the documents that when you're submitting. So what should students know if their passport is expiring soon or expires before the end of their program? Because, for example, as we know, some countries they allow to extend the passport way in advance. Some countries they allow to extend the passport just less than 6 months before the expiry date of the passport. So sometimes this can be tricky. So what suggestions can you give here?
Yeah, that is true. I know that it might be difficult for someone to extend their passport while they're in Canada. So if your passport is expiring, I'd say anytime within a year, the best thing to do is to check with the consulate or the embassy if there is one in Canada, or contact them and to see what the process is like to extend your passport and see how long it typically takes to renew your passport. And like I mentioned earlier, your study permit validity cannot go beyond your passport validity. So this is why typically you have to renew your passport first before you extend your study permit. And if there's 1 year left in your passport, and if you only need 6 months additional time to complete your program, then there's no problem. You can extend your study permit with your current passport that's expiring. But if your program goes beyond your current passport expiry, then it's usually a good idea to extend the passport first so you can make sure that your study permit goes beyond the passport, goes beyond your program completion date, or at least to cover the entire length of your program.
Thank you for highlighting that, Aska. I think a lot of the times some individuals could assume that, the visa in the passport is the study permit, or that the visa in the passport can be longer than the passport validity, because it is the case even for our neighboring country, right? A lot of the times you get the visa B1, B2, or a different type of visa that is in duration longer, and then you can actually keep the old passport, use that visa with a new passport. But it is so important to familiarize yourself with Canadian immigration law and just make sure that you're following the Canadian immigration law. What are some options that are available if study permit extension application is refused?
Yeah, so this is not very common, but unfortunately it does happen. And when you do receive a study permit extension refusal, the first thing you do is to make sure and check what the reason was for refusal. And typically, if it was due to missing a document or something very minor, you can reapply and hope that the next application will be approved. But to reapply, you still have to have a valid study permit. So if your current study permit has already expired, then unfortunately, you might have to restore your status, like I mentioned earlier. But there's not too many options there. And there are other ways to remedy the refusal. The one thing is the reconsideration. So you can request the officer to reconsider the application that has been refused. And this is sort of like an appeal process, which is not often successful, unfortunately, and it does take some time because you have to submit a web form and you have to wait for IRCC to get back to you and then spend time reconsidering the application. It could take months. Another way to do this is a judicial review, which is more of a legal process. So you would have to work with an immigration lawyer and go through the judicial process after you have a refusal. So there are some options, but it really depends on the reason for refusal and the current status that you have in Canada, and also your travel plans. If you have a plan to go back to your home country, then it might be better to leave Canada and reapply for a new study permit from outside Canada.
Thank you very much, Aska. Well, we hope that this is not going to happen with anyone at all, ever. That everybody will be always approved and submitting the full applications. And speaking about IRCC, are there any recent policy changes or IRCC updates that students should be aware of when they're applying for the study permit extension?
Yeah, I would say the new change that has affected a lot of students is the validity of the study permit. So now, if your study permit specifies an institution under the designated learning institution, and if you're no longer enrolled at that institution, then your study permit becomes invalid. And this is tricky because it's different from the expiry date, right? So there's the difference between the study permit expiry date that's printed on the document and also the validity, which could be earlier than the study permit expiry date. So your study permit has to be valid at all times, right, during your studies, and also it has to be valid when you submit the study permit extension application. So if you ever, took some time off that was not authorized, and if your leave, let's say, was longer than 150 days, then it's possible that your study permit has become invalid, and that could impact your study permit extension. You might no longer be eligible to apply for the extension. So I would say that's the most important part, to make sure that your study permit stays valid.
Thank you so much, Aska. And in addition to the 5 mistakes that you've highlighted, what are some practical tips that you would give to students to make sure that the extension process is as smooth as possible and as stress-free as possible?
Yeah, I'd say prepare early, right? And review the resources from your institution, talk to an advisor from your institution, and ask if there's anything that you should explain in your application, or if there's any supporting documents that you should include, because it really depends on your current situation. So not every application is the same, right? So it's important to understand some additional information that you should include in your application. And if you want to consult with anyone, then definitely recommend reaching out to a regulated Canadian immigration consultant like Roman and Natalie, because professionals always have more expertise when it comes to an individual situation. And especially if you have any complications in the past, or a unique situation with your current study permit, then yeah, it's a good idea to talk to a specialist.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as we are concluding our session today, let's talk more about some of your personal experience and, some fun stuff, because we were talking very serious stuff for the past 1 hour. What is one success story you could share with us from your experience working with international students that has stayed with you?
Yeah, there are so many stories that I can share, but yeah, recently I had a transfer student from University of Victoria, and this student decided to transfer to UBC, but she submitted her study permit extension while she was still at UVic, but because she got admitted to UBC after she submitted the application, she submitted a web form to IRCC and asking them to issue a study permit specific to UBC. And that was a proper procedure, and she did what was required at the time. But unfortunately, the application was approved and her study permit was issued, but it was with the University of Victoria. So it was not the correct institution. So she reached out to us, and I helped her submit a reconsideration request explaining what happened and why her study permit wasn't issued with the correct institution. I called IRCC call center just to understand what was happening and what details that they could share that they had with her file. And then we resubmitted again with the thorough explanation. And then waiting months after, finally her study permit got approved with the UBC printed on the document, so she was finally able to start her program at UBC. But it took about 6 months to correct her study permit and contacting IRCC call center, contacting the local MP office. So it was a whole process, but she was very happy after all that she could start at UBC. And I think this is a good example of how important it is to see what options they are available. Because if you are in this situation, you might not know what you can do and what would be the best course of scenario in your situation.
Absolutely. It does sound like it took a little bit of time on the IRCC end to amend things, but it's a huge success story. And our students at UBC are lucky to have you support them, Aska, in their journey and making sure that, their goals become possible because of their legal immigration status. So, to kind of wrap up and end our session for today, I have one last question for you. And this could be, feel free to keep it with the realm of study permit extension or not, or it could be motivational advice. But if you could give every international student one tip in a single sentence, what would it be?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah, not related to a study permit extension, but I would say try everything you're interested in. I was an international student myself, and I was very shy and very worried that I didn't speak English at that time. But, I had lots of hobbies and I wanted to make friends. So I went out of my comfort zone and volunteered, worked at multiple places, made lots of friends, joined student clubs. I think that would be a great way for any international student to, restart their life journey here in Canada. And it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? To be able to study in a foreign country. So take advantage of everything you have, get out of your shell, and enjoy every moment that you have. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I truly believe that getting out from your, comfort zone is the only way how you can succeed in life, right? So, and on this positive note, we'll conclude our session today. And thank you so much, Aska. This was incredible, super interesting, super informative. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person one day and to hosting more webinars in the future with you as well. And thank you so much, Roman, for organizing all this. Of course, it's a lot of efforts, but you did a great job bringing this amazing colleagues to our webinars. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It's always such a pleasure to co-host with you. And thank you, Aska. I echo everything Natalie mentioned. We're truly grateful for your time, your insight, just your presence today. I think international students now know there's a lot of people rooting for them, and a lot of people have gone the path, perhaps less traveled at the time when we were international students. And so we're enthusiastic to support their journey. And on that note, I will also mention that Natalie and I would be more than happy to support your application holistically. We do provide representation, full representation, right? And so we're more than happy to submit your study permit extension for you on your behalf. With a signed retainer agreement, we can also help you apply for your initial study permit from outside Canada or your post-graduation work permit or whichever that application you may want to submit. So feel free to reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to support your journey. And thank you once again to everyone for joining.
Thank you, both of you. It was a pleasure joining you.
Thank you.
Thank you.